I'm sorry. Yeah, title, no titles. Rachel, go ahead. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, so I think what we're going to do is we're going to ask Suzanne to share her story with us for a little bit. And then while we were sitting up here, we were just starting to talk about the interaction between survivors and their children, conversations that did and did not happen, information that was known but not really known about. And because that's kind of a fascinating part for me when we realized my generation, how much this generation didn't really share with us for various reasons. So we're going to start with Suzanne, and if you could start with just what life was like before. How old you were?
I was born in not far from Lvov, which is Lviv now. And now it's the Ukraine, but it was Poland there. I was born in 1937. And, as my father, you heard, my father was a physician and my mother was highly educated as well. And we had a very good life, she had all kinds, my mother couldn't even boil water. She knew nothing about cooking or any of that. She had so much help there, she didn't need it. Anyway, so it was a very, very good life. And then suddenly we were invaded during the Nazi and Russian pact in early 1939. We ended up in the Russian part. They marched into Zbarash, which was a small town not far from Lviv, or Lvov, as we called it. And I remember having Russian officers eating at our house in our dining room. They were invited. And before you knew it, they had retreated to Russia, and we were invaded by the Germans. And I do remember that as well. And I do remember having German officers eating at our organized. There was an action, meaning that they were getting together people, because the first one that I can remember was for people who in any way disabled. Now, one of my father's oldest, both my parents came from very large families. My mother was the youngest of 7, and my father was the middle child of 7. So they were big families. One of his sisters was hunchback. She had scoliosis as a child. She and both her husband, she were taken away. We never saw them again. And then I remember very clearly going to a wedding of one of my cousins. I was one of the youngest children because my father got married very late for certain reasons, which I can bring up. But anyway, there were reasons why he got married late. Anyway, I had older cousins. One had just graduated from pharmacy. No, actually 2. He and his sister were both pharmacists, and his twin brother was a medical doctor that graduated also either from Prague or Vienna, I don't remember. Anyway, they just got married. They were in their 20s, late 20s. And when Edith came out, they're all professionals, all educated people, Jewish, of course, were to meet at a town square. And so they went, and my father did not go because he said, I'm too busy with my patients. I'm not going. And he told my mother to stay home. So she did, and they disappeared. We never heard from them again. So that was the second thing that I remember. And the third thing I remember was German officers at this point, or soldiers coming to our house. And my mother had sewn all her jewelry into her girdle. And by the way, all Jewish women were called Sarah. Like every Jewish lady, that was her name, Sarah.
They were given the middle name of Sarah, right?
Yeah, they were called, yeah. So I remember seeing, I was 3 years old, maybe I remember going like this to my mother. And my mother made me leave the room. And apparently they made her take off the girdle. So all her jewelry. And when I came out of the room finally with her, she had a big gash on her head. So that I remember clearly. And after that, I remember just moving to the ghetto with whatever. Oh, no, there was an action when they came and took all the furniture out. But she had a concert grand, a piano, because she was a very fine musician, pianist. And that, of course, they didn't take out because they, I guess, couldn't get it out of the house, whatever. Anyway, after that, we were sent to the ghetto. But because my father, in the ghetto, we were put in one room, sharing the room with two other families. One was she was a young woman dentist. She was pregnant. I don't know where her husband was. Maybe he was killed or what. And her parents in one room, all of us. I don't remember what the sanitary facilities were. I don't remember. But I do know that there were a lot of epidemics, typhus and typhoid fever and all that. And I remember my father giving me a shot against, I think, typhoid fever. Of course, I carried on like a lunatic, but I was very spoiled. But anyway, that's what he was dealing with, a lot of epidemics. And because of that, he had a pass to go in and out of the ghetto. He was allowed to go out and to tend to patients in the countryside. Because there were a lot of Polish and Ukrainian peasants there. And we delivered babies. He was like a Dr. Welby, if you remember. He was called in the middle of the night. He would go, they'd be knocking on the door. Doctor, my wife is in labor. So I remember that, him going out. But that was not, once he was in the ghetto, nobody came to get him. He just went to visit the patients. And
Did he treat people in the ghetto as well?
Yes. Oh, yes.
As well as outside?
Yes. And by the way, he was, does anybody know what a Judenrat was? You must have, no, okay. It was a group of Jewish prominent people in town who were like the Jewish government of the ghetto who worked with the Germans. They were like the go-between. So he was asked to join that, but he refused. I don't have time for that. Too many patients. Thank God he didn't get involved in that. And we also had my cousin who was like a brother to me. He was 12 years old. I was an only child, and that was his mother and father were the ones. The mother was the hunchback. So he was left without his parents. So my father that was his nephew, and he had practically raised him, so he was very close to us. Anyway, every night while we were in the ghetto, somebody, either my mother or one of the other ladies, would stand watch at the window and listen for noise of a truck noise coming from a larger city, Carnival. And because if they heard the trucks, they knew that an action was coming. So they would notify, make an alarm. And there was a ceiling, like a attic, but it was hidden. So we would all climb into the attic, and other neighbors would come, and after the alarm was given. And one night my mother was on duty and she gave the alarm. And I remember and we could hear them coming into the house looking for us. Luckily, there were no babies there, because anybody who had a baby, they were doomed, because if the baby cried, that would be the end of it. There were a lot of babies that were suffocated by the parents just because if they had other children, in order to save the other children, they couldn't save them. And as a matter of fact, later on, I found out this other couple, they had two little boys, and the younger one was crying in the hiding place that they had, and took him out, and he poisoned him on a park bench. So
The father did?
the father, yeah.
So how long were you in the ghetto?
I wasn't there that long because my father, I don't know how he did it. He probably bribed the guards, or they knew him because he was going in and out or whatever. I wasn't there that long. They found they asked I still remember her name, Mihalina, was my nanny, that she had been my nanny, and he paid her to take me out of the ghetto.
Okay.
And he gave her money. She had a little boy who was a little bit older than I was, and a husband, but he stayed in town and sent me away with her and her boy, because we were a fairly well-known family and people would have recognized me if she hadn't me all of a sudden, So I must have been with her for quite a while because I remember in the middle of at night, I would hear shooting going on. And I remember I knew what was going on. And I would be so nervous that I was throwing up from nerves. And then I remember staying with her. And then one day she said, your father's getting you back. I'm taking you back. She didn't want to stay out of town anymore. So apparently she notified my father and she took me to the town at night, middle of the night. My father was sitting on a bench and he took me. And at that particular time, of course, I didn't know anything that went on behind, I wasn't there. But apparently he had already managed to get my mother out of the ghetto. Again, I don't know whether he bribed somebody, whatever, but he got her out and she was in hiding. He was still around after, but she was in hiding. And the lady in whose house my mother was hiding came in the middle of the night, an old lady. She picked me up and she brought me to my mother. And of course, I remember my mother crying, so happy to see me. Interesting story about how we ended up in that house. There were two women, an old lady, her daughter, who was gorgeous. She looked like Marlene Dietrich, really, and I have photos of her at that age. And a little baby, 2 months old, the daughter's baby. Her husband was a Polish pilot who was in England, and he was one of the pilots that flew planes on D-Day. There was a whole contingent of Polish officers, and he was one of them in England. Anyhow, how we ended up in her house. Apparently my father was, this I found out from her grandson when we went to Poland years later. He told me that story, that she saw my father walking in the street and she went up to him and she said, doctor, because everybody, as I said, knew that he was the local doctor. My daughter had a baby and she's blind. She's 2 months old. Would you mind coming to see her? So he said, yes, he will come tonight or whatever time. And he went to see her and he put some salve on her eyes. Of course, there was no penicillin or anything like that. He probably made a lot of his own medications. And he put salve on her eyes and he said, I'll be back tomorrow. I'll check on her. And he came back the next day and she had opened her eyes. And, woman was beside, it was a miracle, And she said, what can I do for you, doctor? They said, we don't have any money or anything. They said, would you be willing to hide my wife and my daughter? And they were directly across the street from the SS headquarters. Okay, which was a good place to hide. Think about it.
Hide in plain sight.
Right.
Right.
And she notified my father that she had talked it over with her daughter, and her daughter said, okay. So that's when he took my mother over there. And then, of course, she was the lady who picked me up when I came back to town. So I was there with my mother. And what had happened, he used to go to the house. There was a huge brick oven. There's a one-room house. Should have brought the picture. I have the picture. It was a one-room cottage with a chicken coop attached in the back. And in the corner of the house, I still remember, was this huge brick oven where they baked their own bread once a week. It was like a pizza oven, big opening. And, but there was about this much space from the ceiling to the top of the oven. So what happened was every night my father would go with a brick in his medical bag and closed up the top with bricks. He was very handy. And so what happened was every night we would go in out of the chicken coop in the back and go inside that one-room house and climb. He had put in steps inside the flue, and we slept on top of the brick of it. But anyway, so where was I? I tell stories from one end to the other, but I was there with my mother for a while, and we didn't know what had happened to my father. And we had heard that two things we heard. We heard that the ghetto had been raised, Judenfrei, they call that, and free of Jews. And also that the old lady had seen my cousin Muno, Michelle, he ended up being called in France. But anyway, she saw him led with the people to be shot. So my father sat Shiva. No, wait a minute, I gotta tell the story. My father got that. Anyway, one night, about a month after I had gotten there, we heard scratching at the door in the middle of the night. It was my father, so he somehow rather survived whatever it was, and he managed to join us. And a couple of months later, that's when she came over and she said she saw my cousin being led, and my father sat Shiva with ashes in his head and all that. And we figured he was gone, with the rest of the family. And so we were in there, I am guessing, from summer, because I remember being there for Christmas. And there, because the pretty young lady who looked just like Marlene Dietrich had plenty of German officers in the house visiting, and they would talk about the war, and they would talk about the front. And my father sitting separated by a wall, listening to all that. He had a map, and he was making markings how the front was moving. And we would listen, we heard everything. Came Christmas, the table was full of wonderful food they had brought to the house. They should have already known that Jewish people were eating their food. But and one day, and I'm still petrified of German shepherds. One day, a lot of the German officers had a German shepherd with them that were well trained, and he chased one of the chickens into the chicken coop. Now, my father had made a curtain out of straw, so we sat in our straw mats because it was beaten earth. It was freezing in Poland anyway, it's like Russian winters. So you made mats out of straw, and we sat behind. They had brought a lot of books, and they taught me how to read when I was 4. I mean, they spent the whole day with me. But I happened to have been right outside the curtain, play with my favorite chicken. I had a pet chicken there that answered to my commands. What can I tell you? I mean, they're not that dumb.
Chicken whisperer.
You wouldn't believe how smart this thing was. Anyway, all of a sudden, the dog starts chasing a chicken into the chicken coop. It must have been seconds or minutes. My father grabbed me and just threw me behind the curtain. But the dogs were well-trained dogs. They were not spoiled. The officer whistled and the dog turned around and went back. I still have the vision of that dog running. And it was just seconds. You would have discovered us. Anyway, so we were there till I remember, I was 7 by then. I remember that on March 4, 1944, we knew the front was moving. The Russians were coming back. We knew it because we had heard from the Germans that we heard the word Tavarish in the yard, in the backyard, and that means comrade in Russian. So we came out, and they knew one of us kissing and hugging and a whole bit to do, and we were, liberated. But as far as my father was concerned, he knew that my cousin was dead, and my cousin shows up.
Oh, wow.
And my mother always worried about my father's health. She said, Munio was his name in Polish anyway. Your uncle, don't scare your uncle. He thinks you're dead. So let me prepare him, so she prepared him. And of course, we were thrilled to have him. And so that's a wonderful story that I'll tell you how he survived. Anyway, within a few days, the front was moving back and the Germans were coming back. By then, we were not going back into hiding. We were running with the Russian army. We were retreating with the Russian army, with the tanks and the soldiers and the horses and whatever. And it was Poland, and roads were not paved. So it was all deep mud because it was just March, and the winter, the snows had melted. It was freezing cold, and my cousin never let me forget that I was a little skinny little thing, that he carried me on his back So for the rest of my life, he said, but I carried you.
The whole way. So were you the only family that were with the Russian troops at that
That's
point?
all I remember.
Wow.
That's all I remember. I don't remember anybody else.
And when you came out of hiding, since the SS was right across the street,
They were
had they
gone.
already, they had already
Oh,
left?
God, but let me tell you, to follow up on this. Few days later, the front moved back. And we ended up back in our town with the Russian soldiers in our town. And they caught the German officers in the movie house. A whole group of them. That was so unexpected. Well, as you know, the Russians really don't follow too many laws.
Right.
They're not into the Geneva Convention. The next day, all the Russian officers were hanging in the town square.
Oh, the German
The
officers were
Germans,
hanging.
rather, the
Wow.
Germans, rather, that's what I meant. And we all went to town to spit on them. This
Wow.
is the way I remember a little kid like this. No, you know.
So I was just thinking about when I was in college, we lived down the street from a chicken farm. It's not the most pleasant of smells, right?
Yeah, but we
So
had
you were
fresh
living,
eggs.
oh, you did have fresh eggs.
We had
That's
fresh
true.
eggs.
So was this a full, because I'm just trying to imagine 3 people living basically,
Oh, well, I can't, it was small, it was
Right.
small. And we were like against the wall.
And
we
you
had
couldn't
about a
really
space
move.
like this, about a space like that,
Okay.
and then the curtain, the wall, and space like this, and the curtain.
so the only exercise you could really get
Just going around at night to go back to the,
to
to
sleep.
the oven.
Okay.
Yeah, and when they had baked bread, well, if it was winter, we were nice and warm. But during the earlier, like the summer, when we first got there, it was boiling hot to sleep on top there.
And you couldn't really speak, right?
No, I had lost my voice, by the way, because I was forced to whisper. I couldn't raise my voice, but my father had said that my vocal cords had atrophied because they were not used, but eventually it came back, but it took a while. So anyway, so the Russians, liberated us there. And of course, my cousin showed up. So that was a wonderful thing. And then they started picking up the pieces together. It was, okay, we got our house back.
So your original house.
Yeah. And
That's unusual.
Well, it's our original
Yeah,
house, and it was in good shape because it had, and my mother's piano was a huge piano that was part of her dowry. In Europe, you had to have a dowry to get married. It's a whole new story, but it was in perfect tune. She sat down to play Chopin, as I remember, Joe always played Chopin. And it was because the house had been used by German officers, and they loved music, so it was perfect. So we ended up being under Russian occupation. This was 1944. Yeah, as a matter of fact, we had our house in March 1944. We got it back, and I got pets, and life went back to normal, sort of. My father was the head of the polyclinic there, and they made him a major in the Russian army. And I went to a Russian first grade. That was my first grade. I was 7, school. And it was with the Stalin's picture and Lenin's picture, and I wore a red thing around my neck, and it was learning Russian, and I was the only child in the class that had hair. All the other kids' heads were shaved because my father assured them I wouldn't, because of lice, infestation of lice. But he said, look, if she gets lice, I'll take care of it. I don't know what to do. So I'm walking, but there were boys and girls, but you couldn't tell the difference because we all wore uniforms, green uniforms with the red thing around our neck. And then
So who were these other students? Were they other
from town.
families from
Yeah,
town?
but I don't remember Jewish children. It was mostly non-Jewish children, Ukrainian and Polish kids. Yeah. And yeah, my father spoke Ukrainian fluently, and Polish, of course, was our language. We spoke Polish at home, by the way. We never spoke Yiddish or anything like that. My mother came from a family they were totally assimilated. They were not religious, but they were culturally Jewish. She was very active in her youth. She was very active in the Herzl movement, which was a movement to get Palestine to be Jewish. And then, as a matter of fact, one of his sisters went on a honeymoon to Palestine in the 1920s. So she spoke Hebrew. My mother spoke Hebrew fluently as well. But again, it was not a religious household. My father came from a religious household, but of course, with my mother there, and that war on top of it, you couldn't really say. But that's what I'm told. I wanted to tell you the story how my cousin survived. When my father went into hiding, he made arrangements for his nephew who had survived. His parents were dead, to go to a small village, a small hamlet, and my father made arrangements with one of his patients who was a barber, that he would take my cousin in and hide him. So my father had given him money and told him where to go and told him to follow the stars. It was summer, to go follow the stars to find the village. So my cousin, this we heard later on, of course. So my cousin followed the stars and he ends up in this little hamlet and he sees a young woman walking a dog. So he stopped her and he said, would you know where the barber so-and-so, where his house is? So she pointed it out to him. And so he went and he knocked on the door. This was early morning and the barber opens the door and he says, I know who you are. I was expecting you, Dr. Schmeier's nephew, but I cannot keep you. So there is my cousin. He's 16 years old. His parents are dead. He knows where we are, but he knew there was no room for him there. And so what is he going to do? And he's sitting there, doesn't know what to do. All of a sudden, there's a knock on the door. And the young woman, who was a total stranger, knocks on the door and she said, can I come in and let her in? She said, is there anything I can do to help? So the barber tells her the story that he can't take him. So she said, let me go home. I'll talk to my father-in-law, who's our family patriarch, and my husband, and I'll see. She comes back. No, total stranger. Comes back about 15, 20 minutes later, and she said, come with me. We're going to hide you in our hayloft.
Wow.
I mean, can you imagine?
Right.
Now, she was the mother of 3 children. And if they had been caught, they all would have been shot, including the children. So
So it was a
that
big
just
risk
shows
to
you.
her and her
Oh
family.
my God, unbelievable. So later, many years later, my cousin lives in Corsica, and he's brought her children and her grandchildren to visit him. He said to her, he says, how could you do this? You had 3 children. You were in total danger. She said, well, she said, I was hoping that if one of my children had been in that kind of trouble, that somebody would be nice enough to take care of, to shelter them. So there's the answer. There were wonderful people, a lot of wonderful people. Oh, and to add to this, the barber turned out was hiding 30 people in the cave and feeding them. And they were the ones who told them, you can't bring anybody else here.
Wow.
So there were a lot of heroes in that time. Very, very brave people. Very good people.
So what brought you to the United States?
What brought us to the United States? The fact, well, many things. So we just came. Oh, so one night we were still in our town, in our home, living a nice life. I got pets. I always had pets, cats and dogs, you name it. Anyway, knocking on the door, Russian soldiers. This time it's Russian soldiers. This was 1945. We heard Jews have gold. Okay. So they went through, you used to get butter from the farms and bricks and whatever good. They went through everything with their bayonets checking for gold. Obviously, they didn't find any, but at that point, my father said, that's it. We are not staying here anymore. Enough. We didn't escape from the Germans. We were going to get out. Somehow or other get a permission to get out. And so I remember sitting at the train station for 2 weeks. We didn't know when the train would arrive. We had left the house, left everything, whatever they had, I don't know. obviously all his office furniture, whatever. And we sat and waited. My cousin was with us, of course, Michelle. And finally the train came and we went to West, which was part of Free Poland at that time, which had been an ethnic German area. But the Germans had escaped to Germany, and there was an area, Bittum called it, the city was. And so that's where we moved to. And I'm just, this are guesses, but we ended up with quite a nice apartment and that had a medical office in front with medical furniture. And probably it had been a German doctor's apartment, I'm guessing, because all the furniture was there. So he was able to open up a practice there. And at that time, penicillin had become available. This is from 45 to 46, penicillin became available. So I remember on a shingle he had that he specialized in venereal diseases. And he would have patients sleeping in the office at night because he had to give shots every 6 hours. And these men would be wandering, usually men, wandering around our apartment in the back looking for a bedroom because we were in bed sleeping and they're wandering around. But anyway, that was his practice. A lot of people showed were there. And again, he was the one who was giving the shots every 6 hours. So that's what it was. I went to school. By then I was going to a Polish school. And I was not allowed to say I was Jewish. Then we were talking after the war. I went to church with my class. And but my teacher knew I was Jewish, and I'll tell you why. We started getting care packages. Does anybody know what care packages are? They used to send dried milk powder and coffee and stuff. My aunt, one of my father's sister, was in the United States, and she was sending the care packages. So to pacify my teacher, because I was always late, because they wouldn't let me leave till I finished eating, and I was a non-eater. So by the time I came to school, it was late. So I would bring her coffee, and she forgave me for being late. But so that was it. So she knew I was Jewish better, but that's it. We kept it quiet. And apparently they had started hearing about programs again. So at that point, my parents decided that they were leaving that area. And my mother, I remember, went to Warsaw. She must have gotten some kind of a permit. My mother, by the way, was a teacher. She had a whole school going. And what other? I mean, there were all kinds of crazy things that went on. I remember, but the details are not that important. Anyway, one day I come home from school. This was 1946 by then. We're leaving. That was it. Bags were packed up. Everything was left, and we're on our way to somehow or other. We got on the train and we headed west, and we ended up in Czechoslovakia, I told you. And we ended up in a DP camp there, which is deported persons camp. And the women were in one area. By the way, just a little incident. A woman who had a little boys, there were no. See, a lot of the women, like my mother, had gotten Aryan papers, what they called, which meant that we were not Jewish. And she was ready to leave from our small town before even we got into the ghetto. But at the last minute, my father said, "You'll never make it. If you get caught and questioned, you'll never survive." So he took us off the fiacre, which is what they used. But if you had a little boy, Jewish boys were circumcised. So that was the first thing they would look at. The boy was circumcised, forget it, you were Jewish, because Polish people did not circumcise their children, or Ukrainians. So, but anyway, that's just a little incident thing. But anyhow, so we ended up in Prague. And you asked me a question why we came to America.
You came to
Okay, the questions that this is 1946, this is after the war. There was a choice of going to Germany from the DP camp, because they had heard that if you went to Germany, you were able to get out sooner and go to the United States. Now, we had a choice of going to Israel, which was Palestine still, because Israel didn't become
Mhm.
Israel till 48. But my father's, and I remember that clearly, said there are too many doctors there. There are too many doctors and it's socialized medicine and it's not for me. Okay, so he wanted to go to the United States, but the only way we could go to the United States, we'd have to go mostly either Germany.
Hmm.
But his sister, he had found out that one of his sisters had survived in France. She had been in France during the war and they managed to be in the Vichy government area, which was the free France, the south of France. They were from Paris, but they had escaped to Marseille. Anyway, she wanted to see his sister, of course. So we headed to France. And that's where we lived for 5 years, from 46 to 1951, till we got our visa to come to the United. We had to wait 5 years for the visa to come. He couldn't do anything. He was not allowed to do anything medically. He was not allowed, even if he had studied in France, in the university and medical school, he could not practice there as a foreigner. So he knew he had to get to the United States to get his medical license again, which he did eventually. And that's how we ended up in the United States, in Brooklyn.
So we were in Brooklyn. That's where my mom was from,
Brooklyn.
born and raised Brooklyn. We have like 15 minutes and I wanted to talk a little bit about what we were talking about before. Being a second generation, it was never discussed
No.
growing up. And we were talking about how survivors never talked about
No.
it.
Mm-mm.
So as a child, it was one of those, you heard about it, but you didn't know what it was. There were buzzwords that were maybe said around the house, but you were never really 100% sure. I do remember when I was in school and they would show movies, remember the old movies, not, right? I would always ask permission to leave when they were showing the videos from the Holocaust, because I never knew if I'd see my dad. That's like all I knew, right? There was this chance. So you were the same way. You didn't really talk about it
Not
with
at
your
all.
family. What changed for you?
Okay, I was obviously a language teacher. What else would I do? I mean, I spoke French fluently and I took Spanish in the university. I went to University of Michigan. I took Spanish as a second language. So I taught both languages. Anyway, I worked on Long Island in a high school, which was really predominantly Jewish. We never talked about it. The kids had no way. Schindler's List came out and that opened up a whole new world. The kids started asking questions and we took them to see the film. And that's when the discussion started. So I spoke to different classes and they were getting it. And just another little vignette. A young teacher was hired in September. I remember she was a music teacher. And she had some kind of a sign in the back of her car on her bumper. And so one of the kids, for some reason, he was an obnoxious kid, but he was smart. He was a senior at that time. He went to his grandfather, who had been very active before the war with the anti-Nazi movement in New York. And he asked the grandfather, do you know anything about this? So the grandfather decided to call ADL, which is Anti-Defamation League. And they did a little research. So happens that a close friend of mine was working at ADL at that time. She got the phone call, as a matter of fact. So they looked it up and it turned out to be one of these Holocaust denier societies from Chicago. I think Mel Gibson was part of that, the actor Mel Gibson. So naturally, they called the assistant principal at my school, who was Slotsky, was Jewish too. The next day she was gone. Yeah, so, but other than that, it was really very little till Schindler's List came out. Then there was interest and kids were asking questions and so forth. So
And when we were talking about that, when Dr. Berenbaum was here, he was talking about through the decades, and there was the docudrama Holocaust.
Right.
So that was the very first time I saw, my dad was not a big TV watcher other than the news, 6:30, Walter Cronkite or whoever, right? That series came on, that docudrama, and my dad sat there and watched the entire thing. And I remember my mom telling my sister and I, don't bother him, don't talk to him, leave him alone. And first time I saw my dad cry, first time I really ever saw my dad angry, other than at things my sister and I would do as little kids. And that was probably the first real interaction I saw of my dad with the topic. My dad was very much the same thing. He did not really start talking about it until he retired then. And he went on the circuit, right? He just became involved with different organizations so he could talk about it. Did you start visiting schools, or was it just conversation?
Just my high school.
Just your
I
high
worked.
school.
And 2015, I was contacted by, of course, my name is, before that, after Schindler's List, Steven Spielberg donated all his funds to film the survivors in their homes. So I had a film crew in my house. The reason why they knew about me is because I get German reparations. And all this is, it's written. So they contacted me about the film. So they came to my house, the crew, and they, 3 days. So there was of course, it's in Yad Vashem in Israel. It's in Washington, and it's in New York. Anyway, 2015, I get an email from the Israeli embassy in Krakow that would I like to meet the descendants of the lady and her daughter who saved our lives. And needless to say, of course, within 2 or 3 days, I got an email from her grandson, who was actually named after my father. And they live, of course, they don't live in that area anymore because that became the Ukraine in 1989. So then they moved, the family, because the grandma died many years before. And the mother, the beautiful Marlena Dietrich type, she moved away from it. The father, by the way, came back from being a pilot in England, and he became a teacher, and they had 3 children. And they had the little girl, the baby that my father had treated. She had just died when we, anyway, we were invited to Krakow. My whole family went, my grandchildren, my children, everybody went. So we met the family, and they had a beautiful ceremony in Krakow. We had the ambassador, the American ambassador was there, the Israeli ambassador was there, the mayor of Krakow was there, and it was just in a museum, Galicia Museum, which is the area that I come from, is Galicia, but the museum is named Galicia. We had a wonderful time. We stayed there, we visited. Of course, we went to Auschwitz, of course. We leased a van, the whole family, and we were driven there to whatever. So it was quite an experience, and meeting that family was fabulous. I'm still in touch with them. We're in touch. So it was wonderful. He doesn't speak a word of English, but I still speak enough Polish to be able to communicate. But his son is fluent in English, so that's good. And so that was the end, like the coda to the whole thing. And there were things that the son told me, the grandson rather. He said, and my mother had told me, he said, that was the Yaja, that was the beauty, that one of the officers that died, you gotta be careful, because word gets around, he says, we know there's somebody hiding.
Wow. Really?
That's what he
So
told
the
me.
officers knew.
Well,
Some of
maybe
them,
some of
some.
them.
Wow.
Just be careful, he said to her. So,
Wow. Does anybody have any questions for Suzanne?
yes, sir.
Yes, the young man standing
Yes.
up.
So, I stepped out for a second rudely, but did you address the righteous elimination when you went back to?
Well, yeah, this
Yeah.
was,
Yeah.
oh, yes, we had that was part of the ceremony there. And of course, I made a speech in English and I had a translator there. And, I told them, a lot of things. By the way, we did the Schindler's factory is in Krakow. And it's a museum now. And I want you to know that the tiles on the floor were swastikas. All the tiles on the floor were swastikas. So we were delighted to be walking on them. Just step on them. Yeah.
We have a couple of questions online. So someone wanted to know, there's a lot of people currently work on Long Island. Which high school?
Oh, Franklin K, where I grew up,
Where you taught
or I
at?
taught Roslyn High School. Roslyn.
Rosalind High School.
By the way, infamous people went to that school. Madoff, does anybody know who Madoff was? His kids went there. I remember his two boys. But that was way before the scandal, way before. But the thing was, that's nothing to do with the Holocaust. But apparently a lot of people from that area invested with him. And, they felt privileged that he allowed, they had to have a lot of money before they could invest with him. And when they invested, they were so pleased that he allowed them to invest with him.
Anybody else online who's listening, have a question? Briefly, we want to allow them to unmute. They want to unmute, just change the permissions on there.
What did you ask me?
Oh, how many languages do you speak?
If you listen to my husband passed away, but if you listen to him, I spoke 8 languages. He was very proud. He was very proud. I spoke 8 languages, but I didn't. But I speak Polish. Russian I handle quite well. German I know I can. Yiddish I understand, although we never spoke Yiddish at home. Of course, I speak French fluently, speak English pretty well, and Spanish because I minored in Spanish in high school. But of course, I'm not in high school, I'm sorry, in college. But now I have good practice of Spanish because everybody who works on the Mayflower where I live, I speak Spanish to them.
But it's interesting. It seems like most survivors had multiple languages.
Yeah,
And I'm
you
not
had
saying
to.
just English. Like my father, it was Yiddish, Hebrew, Czech, some German, French, and
Russian.
Russian, probably a little bit of
course,
Russian.
Of course.
And he used to always comment, my father had a very, very strong Eastern European accent.
Not like Suzanne.
I didn't hear it.
You hear my
No,
New York
I hear
accent.
New York. You'll talk like a New York accent.
Oh, you're
And my
from New
dad's
York.
comment, somebody would say something to him about his accent, and he would be, how many languages do you speak? There's a reason I have this accent.
Right.
But that's the thing of survivors. They were with so many
Surrounded
other,
by so
many
many
languages.
different languages.
I've actually said that in a classroom when someone would comment on my students' accents and say, I can't understand because of their accent. I'm like, oh, you speak.
Yep.
And of course, it was really meant sarcastically, tongue in cheek and passive aggressive, but I was like,
It's funny. I remember being in, we did a lot of traveling, my husband and I, but anyway, we were in Holland. And my husband was very friendly, outgoing. He would just pick up people on the street and ask them for directions, always in English, because he was an American born. That's all he spoke. And they always answered him in English. So to one of the ladies, I remember being in Holland, and I said, how come you speak? She said, because nobody speaks Dutch.
Yeah.
That was her answer.
So we got another question. Did you experience anti-Semitism when coming to America?
Me?
Yes.
Not the only memory that I have of any kind of because don't forget, I was in New York, so I went to a high school that was all the Jewish kids were the ones going to college with the high grades and all that. So, but anyway, I went to University of Michigan, as I said before, and I worked there in the admissions office while I was a student there. And there were several girls working in the office there, and they were from Upper Peninsula in Michigan. Michigan is 2 peninsulas, so 2 areas, north and anyway, we started talking and they found out I was Jewish. And one of the girls said to me, "You're Jewish and you're so nice."
I got that too.
So I said, "Yeah, well, why don't you touch here? I've got horns."
Horns.
I said,
Exactly what I do.
"Try to find the horns." So I was like, "I was so
Those are,
cool."
I would always, I remember, it would always be, you're so nice, Jewish, you don't look Jewish,
So you don't look
and you
Jewish.
don't act Jewish.
Jewish, right? I would,
Can you explain what that means? 'Cause but yeah.
yeah, but that's about it. Actually, in New York, I never, again, our school, where I went to high, that's another cute story. I mean, I'm just throwing it in. Just remember my mother, as I said, was highly educated. She had a doctorate in literature, but anyway, she knew how to deal with people. So here she is, hardly speaks any English, finds out that where we lived in Brooklyn, the high school wasn't that good there. So she goes, buys a big bouquet of flowers, and she goes to the school that she was told was a good high school, goes directly to the principal, goes to him, she, with her broken English, I want you to know, she says, "Look, I have a daughter who's very smart, she's very nice, and this high school where we live is not very good. Would you mind," and brings him the big bouquet of flowers, "would you mind taking her to your school?" Guess what? That's where I went to school. And I had to take the elevated train every day to go to school, the L going and the L coming back. But I got to the school that she wanted.
Now, did your family, because you said your family was secular, you were pretty much.
Yes,
income.
yeah.
Did you,
My father went
Remain
to
sec-
shul.
did you
My
rem-
father went to
when you
shul
came
on
to the
holidays.
States?
Yeah.
okay.
And, but my mother didn't.
And what about you? Did you stay more secular? Because it's always an extreme of one way or the other, I think, with a lot of survivors too.
We were
They
secular.
secular or they
Yeah,
become much more.
yeah. So,
You have to get all Suzanne.
I mean, my son was bar mitzvahed, but now he's married to a Filipino. And my daughter's married to a Tanzanian. And my grandson is in Korea because he just graduated from West Point. He's a second lieutenant in Korea. So I said, "No, I know you're gonna bring a Korean girl home so we can complete the circle."
I'll let you- My son was in Korea for 2 years.
Loved it, right?
He did, and he
No one
married.
loves
So,
it.
yeah,
Yeah, he
he
did.
found a wonderful young
Oh, there
lady
you
and they
go.
got
You see
married.
what I
So
mean?
yes.
Question. So I won't ask what I always ask at the end. Do you have any parting messages for the teachers who are online? We got about 46 online. Some here.
Well, I'm a great patriot of this country, I have to tell you, and whatever's going on now is not very nice. All the things that are going on, but it's gonna come to an end because American people are positive thinking people, they're hardworking people, they're loving people, and things will straighten up. And I'm as pessimistic as I am about what's going on today. And of course, with all the killings that is beyond all comprehension, but it's gonna be okay. It's gonna be all right. Yeah. And because this country was very good to us, very good to us. My mother, by the way, loved this country because she came from a very well-to-do background. She had helped to do everything for her. She came here, she had a small apartment, she went to work, she loved it. She felt free, she felt she could do what she wanted, she could have a subscription to whatever opera or theater or whatever she wanted, because we were in New York, that didn't hurt either. But the thing was, she felt free, she wasn't afraid that somebody will come knocking on the door in the middle of the night, which is what we were living under, constant fear. And France, where you didn't have those fears, but they were very bad to people who were foreign people. And you couldn't even we had an apartment, and the way they got the apartment was a strange, it was a tiny little apartment behind the building, whatever. But anyway, they were lucky to get it. This couple was walking in the street in Paris, and they were both survivors from concentration camps, different camps, and they met in France and married. As they were walking in the street, a woman walking towards them recognized the husband as a capo in one of the concentration camps. Now, do you know what a capo is? They were the Jewish people who helped the Germans to bury the dead and whatever needed to be done, the dirty work the capos did. Well, she started screaming in the street. She recognized, and the wife had no idea. So they split up and they had that apartment and somehow or other she had to get, they had to get out. We ended up with that apartment. But, you know, this is what went on, you know, with, yeah. But anyway, this country, as I said, I'm getting back to that. I have hope and I think it'll happen, that things will straighten out and things will get back to normal. This was just a horrible time. And to add one more thing, which is negative, is I just have to tell you, I am horrified by what's going on in Ukraine because it is horrible. But I don't know whether I should add the negative note, but I have to tell you that from my memory, the Ukrainians were terribly anti-Semitic. Even though they had a Jewish president now, I don't know what happened there, but the Ukrainians were the ones, and I know that for a fact, they did all the shooting of those mass graves. The Germans were there to round up the people, and the German officers would stand there, and it was the Ukrainians and the Lithuanians, by the way, that was another country. They did all the mass murders themselves. So I'm, you know, mixed feelings about what's going on there. Now, the fact that they have a Jewish president and vice president, big positive as far as I'm concerned. But of course, he was a famous comedian. So I'm sure that had a lot to do with it because he was very well known in the country. But again, I still have the terrible memories of the shootings going on and all that. And there were Ukrainians doing that. So anyway, whatever that's worth. Whatever that's worth, it's just bad memories, and that's it. But again, that's the way things are. But this country, no, this country is a wonderful country. I'm a great patriot. And if they called me to go fight for this country, I would go. I would go. And I'm so proud of my grandson who is graduated from West Point and he's a soldier and all that. Of course, he doesn't think it's such a great deal, but I'm very pleased, very
I could
pleased.
imagine Suzanne go around. No,
Of course.
honestly, thank you so much. I'd like to thank Suzanne for coming out and sharing.
Are you all teachers here?
They're all teachers. Here.
Wonderful.
And everyone who's online, we've got about 47 people online who are all teachers as well.
Oh, wonderful. So you'll spread the knowledge. Are you, most of you history teachers or English, or you're a history teacher? Oh, yeah, I spoke recently at the, told you at the church, St. Margaret Mary in Winter Park. Spoke to 8th graders and it was beautifully done. There were individual students would come up, sat in front of me with a bunch of questions. And they were so well behaved and so lovely. And one of the kids asked me, which was very interesting, 8th grader, do you have any psychological problems from what you went
Did you
through?
experience any trauma after?
Yeah. It was 8th grader. I was just totally baffled, but no, I was totally amazed by that, which I do. I mean, I did. I had, and it didn't show up till way later. One of the reasons why basically I'm pretty well together is because I survived with both parents, and that's a big deal. Because you know that if your parents are there, no matter how bad things are, they'll take care of it, they'll watch out. But I did. I ended up having agoraphobia. After my son was born, I have 2 children. After my son was born, I started having fear of open spaces. And nobody knew about it. I didn't understand it myself. And I would go out with my friends. It was okay when I went with somebody else, but I could not go by myself. I was afraid. I couldn't even cross the street. or that panic. So I just happened to have mentioned it casually to someone I had met who was a psychiatric social worker. She said, Suzanne, there's help for that. You don't need to suffer. So she sent me to a group on Long Island Jewish Hospital, where they had a group therapy for that. And I'm basically recovered from it. It was behavior modification, where they took me to all kinds of situations that were causing me anxiety. But I was with the group and we worked out. So, but it was an interest. So I told the kid that. I mean, you know, why not? He asked me that question. I told him about it. So, but I thought that was very interesting of this little boy who's what, 13 years old. They were 8th graders. So, yeah.
Get a chance to look up the project. It's called Names Not Numbers. And it's not typically done. St. Margaret Mary is the only Catholic school that has run
Yes.
this program. It's for young film students, and they've actually interviewed thousands of Holocaust survivors, and they do. And that's the organization's Names Not Numbers, and they've been collecting, and they actually create little hour-long documentaries of them interviewing. And it's using filmmaking techniques. There are also a lot of other interviewing strategies that you can use, but then collecting and creating an actual. I know that when I said that the documentary is
I have
quality,
it.
it's as
Beautiful.
good as anything you see on that.
Oh, it's beautifully
Yes.
done. It's so
Yeah.
professional.
If I give a link to the one that they made here, it's got Suzanne's story, I'll make sure I'll send it out to everyone. She's supposed to send it to me soon, but again,
Yeah.
I'd like to thank Suzanne for coming out.
Oh, Are you mostly high school teachers? Elementary? Well, it's never too early to start talking to them about this.
And if you'd like, I'm getting ready to introduce Dr. Wenton, so if you'd like to I can either have.
I can escort you.
Yeah, unless you want to sit here with Dr. Wenton for his presentation.
Oh,
It's up to you, but yeah, if you want to just grab a seat and you can walk over here. Everyone else who's online, if you would like to, we're going to switch over to the next session, and I'm going to introduce our next speaker. So if you'd like to go ahead, we're going to close out this session, stop the recording, and we will see you in the next session.